the St Albans Certificate of Theology, which is run at the college, the cathedral. So very welcome, Caroline, and we're eager to hear what you have to say.
Well, it's really exciting to be here this evening. I think as an Anglo-Saxonist, being able to stand and wander through the places that people have stood and wandered through thousands of years before you have is really exciting. And it's also a bit of a novelty for me. Normally, I have to go to church and sit and listen to my husband talking on and on. He's a vicar. So today I get to get my own back. He's got to sit there and listen to me this time. And I can tell you that my talk is at least twice as long as his sermons. So, blood, bones and books, getting to know Athelstan. Most historians, when faced with the topic of writing about the Anglo-Saxon King Æthelstan, lament the paucity of historical sources available to them. If you compare what vestiges of information we have about Athelstan with, say, his grandfather, King Alfred the Great, you can readily see why. If you try and sort through sources from Alfred's reign, you almost feel the need to pull on some heavy wellies or some gaiters just to stand a chance of navigating the mire of charters, law codes, letters, adoring biographies and folklore. Alfred's court was so prolific in its very self-conscious literary output that if we weren't aware of how much time was spent fighting the Viking invaders and hiding in the marshes, we could be forgiven for thinking that he had just a little bit too much spare time on his hands. Athelstan, however, is a very different story. We have some charters, coins, law codes and manuscripts, but none of these in abundance. He's barely mentioned even in the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, which is a go-to source for historians wanting an Anglo-Saxon view of the important dates in history. Not a single contemporary narrative survives to tell us of his reign. No small wonder then that a lot of people only know him as the answer to the pub quiz question, who was the first king of England? I'm sure, given that you've all come here this evening, that I can declare the present company exempt from such an accusation. One notable exception to this relative lack of evidence is the chronicle of a 12th century historian, William of Malmesbury, who writes very favourably about King Æthelstan in his Gesta Regum Anglorum, the deeds of the kings of the English. He writes comparatively extensively about Athelstan, but we have to treat his account carefully. You should be aware that when he writes sentences such as, "Concerning this king, there is a vigorous tradition in England that he was the most law-abiding and best educated ruler that they have ever had," that not only was Athelstan a great patron of Malmesbury, where William lived, but that he was also buried there. While it might be a step too far to say that William's chronicle was the Anglo-Saxon version of the Lonely Planet Guide to places that you should definitely visit and give plenty of money to, we must nevertheless be cautious in using this source without scrutiny. So, for some, Athelstan's rule is a source of frustration, an example of the limitations which we face in dealing with the Dark Ages. However, I think that actually what little we have is wonderfully personal and unusual, and it glows all the more beautifully against a backdrop of mystery and uncertainty. What I'd like to do this evening is to take you through some of the most significant objects and texts which we have remaining to us from Athelstan's reign, and try to piece together an image of Athelstan which goes beyond the conventional image of this man. For many who have studied Athelstan to a greater or lesser degree, he is a glorious warrior and a noble king. This I would not dispute, so I shall briefly go through just a couple of the unique sources which contribute to this image of the king. If you look at your handout and skip to the second page, the poem which I have typed out in figure 2 is a prime example of this particular kind of evidence. It is imaginatively named the Carta de Regressus, after its first line, and appears to be a letter sent by a certain Peter on behalf of the king to Athelstan's household, relating to the events of 927. This is an important year when Athelstan took control of York, the Scandinavian stronghold previously held by Sitrick, the leader of the York Vikings. This event is particularly significant as it marks the awareness of the conquest of all former English territories, that is, lands which had previously been considered Anglo-Saxon rather than Celtic, and which had been taken by the Vikings during their raiding and settlement over the previous centuries. If you look into the third stanza, the author of this poem refers to Ista perfecta Saxonia, this England made whole. It's a realization of Bede's gens Anglorum, the English people, which he was talking about early in the 8th century. It's made possible by the power vacuum that was left by the death of Sitrick, the leader of the York Vikings, and Athelstan's decisive action to seize this territory during a moment of temporary Scandinavian weakness. Not long after this event, we have records of the submission and acceptance of Athelstan's overlordship by rulers of Scotland, Wales, and the old Brittonic territories in the north. And you can see that in the fifth stanza it is, you can see Constantine, king of the Scots, who hastens to Britain to bear his loyal support. After this, we start to see charters, which are official grants of land and privilege, being issued in Athelstan's name, which look like the one in figure 3 at the bottom of the page underneath your poem. The text of the main body of the charter is not the particular focal point that I'm making, but what I'd like you to notice is the exceptionally long witness list at the bottom of the charter. That's those 6 columns full of names at the bottom. These are all the names of important people who would witness the king's act of governance. All the names of people who were in attendance to the king at any given point in time and in any place that he travelled to. To put this into perspective, some previous kings had barely had a handful of names at the bottom there. Even Alfred the Great only made it to 19 names. But some of Athelstan's charters regularly exceeded 100 names. That's 100 people around him, witnessing him, seeing him acting as a king in all sorts of different places. Even if the subject of Anglo-Saxon chancery doesn't get your heart racing and bring out the colour in your cheeks, and I know a few people for whom it does, you can see that this is indicative of a king who is able to command the obedience of a huge number of important people. Along with the Scottish king and Anglo-Saxon nobles, bishops, and clergy, these witness lists regularly included the names of important Welsh rulers, such as Hywel Dda of Deheubarth, Idwal Fawr of the northern branch of Gwynedd, Morgan of Morgannwg, Tewdwr of Brycheiniog, Gwriab ab Dodri. In a world where the more unpronounceable names on your witness list, the better, this is a pretty impressive lineup. Nevertheless, the crunch point came in 937 at the famous Battle of Brunanburg, where those who had supposedly been giving him allegiance from across his territories, including Constantine, who we've seen in our poem, the Carta de Regressus, they united to form a great army of the Dublin Norse, the Scots, and the Strathclyde Welsh against Athelstan. The Anglo-Saxon chronicle for this date is unusually forthcoming and poetic, noting very peculiarly in verse that after the battle, 5 young kings lay on that field of battle, slain by swords. Athelstan, as I'm sure you'll be able to gather, was not one of them. This image of a king soaked in the blood of his enemies and emerging triumphant from the carnage of battle to be the first to legitimately claim the title Rex Anglorum, the King of the English, is probably a familiar one to you all, and many leave it there. Certainly, this title is more comprehensive than any title genuinely and deservedly claimed by any of his Anglo-Saxon predecessors. Even his grandfather, Alfred the Great, only rose so far as to king over the whole English people except for that part which was under Danish rule. Very catchy. But there is so much more to Athelstan. For a start, I believe that for Athelstan, his international relations were based as much on diplomacy as they were on conquest. Blood formed part of his passage to the international stage, but it was not always through being shed. If you look at figure 4 on your handouts, you can see that Athelstan was blessed by a large family, and particularly was blessed by an abundance of sisters. As a little sister, I feel that I can say that with some authority, although I'm not sure that my brother would agree. Sarah Foote, Athelstan's modern biographer, puts it slightly differently, saying that any man whose parents managed to provide him with 8 or 9 sisters deserves our sympathy. Now, I made this diagram using some modern family tree maker software, which seemed completely unprepared for such a mire of marriages and offspring. So I hope you'll forgive any difficulties that you might find in reading it. But if you look at the tree, you can see at the top Edward the Elder, who is Athelstan's father. He married not once, not twice, but 3 times, which is one of the reasons we have so many offspring from him. If you're unfamiliar with Anglo-Saxon names, it might help you to know that 12 of those names on this family tree are female, and 9 of them, as far as we can tell from our sources, are either Athelstan's sisters or half-sisters. And Athelstan was indeed blessed by them, as they would prove marvelous bargaining tools in the game of international relations. In this way, Athelstan forged contacts on the international stage which stretched further and with more intensity than any Anglo-Saxon king before him. You can see from this family tree that Athelstan married off his siblings to rulers across Europe. If you look particularly on the bottom line, the children of Alflad, you can see that Eadgifu marries Charles the Simple, the king of Francia. Eadhild gets packaged off to Hugh, Duke of the Franks. Eadgyth marries Otto I, first king and then later emperor of Germany. Alphavu, if that is her name, we're not quite sure, is married to Louis, the brother of Rudolph of Burgundy. And under the 3rd marriage to Eadgifu, there's another Eadgifu who marries Louis, Prince of Aquitaine. When Otto I approached Athelstan for the hand of one of his sisters, Athelstan seems to have taken the view that he had plenty to offer up, and so sent a choice to the German king. One can't help but think that it must have been a fairly demoralizing experience for the one that wasn't chosen. I can't help but picture a Generation Game style conveyor belt of sisters going round. And as if his family weren't big enough, he was also a prolific foster father. He is known to have fostered Louis, his nephew and the heir of Charles the Bald of Francia, Alain, who was to become ruler of Brittany with Athelstan's military aid, and to Hakon the Good, the son of Harold Fairhair of Norway. He is also believed to have fostered the son of Constantine of the Scots as a hostage after the Battle of Brunanburg. This is a man who saw the potential for a power that was based not just on his prowess on the battlefield, as so many Anglo-Saxon kings before him, but on something more lasting, more deep-rooted, and with more potential than can traditionally be attributed to Anglo-Saxon kings. And his bloodline certainly realized this potential in ways which seem to have appealed especially to Athelstan. This is where the bones and the books come in. For Athelstan appears to have been a prodigious collector of religious relics and manuscripts, many of which came his way as a result of his international contacts. The abbot of St. Samson of Dol in Brittany wrote to him enclosing relics which he says he knows to be dearer to you than all earthly substance. According to a mixture of historical evidence and legend, he appears to have had in his possession a variety of relics, such as the head of Branwaladur, a legendary figure of Welsh folklore, St. Samson's arm, the lance of Charlemagne, which pierced the side of Christ, a gift from Duke Hugh of the Franks, and the sword of Constantine, which included a fragment of the true cross, including a nail set in crystal in the hilt. Quite an impressive collection. But not only was Athelstan an avid collector of any auspicious bones that he could lay his hands on, he was remarkably generous in dispersing these throughout his realm to bestow favour upon and show support for his religious institutions. Malmesbury, in particular, benefited greatly from his beneficence. Under him, and thanks also to the foundations of support for religious houses laid in the reigns of his father and grandfather, the church in England began to become strengthened and to flourish. And along with the relics came the clerics who carried these bones, and as a side effect, the learning that they brought with them. This is not exactly a new phenomenon. If you look at figure 5, this is an acrostic poem written for Athelstan, probably, although not certainly, during the reign of his grandfather Alfred. In this poem, an old man in the role of the biblical Samuel predicts a prosperous reign for the young boy Athelstan. If you look down the left-hand side of the poem, you'll note the letters Athelstan, which correspond with the first letter of each line. If you look to the right-hand side, you'll see the name Johannes, or John. The timing and the context suggests that this John, which is not a common Anglo-Saxon name, is quite possibly John the Old Saxon, who is known to have been at the court of Alfred the Great, and was quite possibly Alfred the Great's tutor. John the Old Saxon was not the only foreign scholar at Alfred's court. We also know of at least 2 other influential scholars named in our sources, Grimbald from Francia and Asa from St. David's in southwestern Wales. There may well have been more, but their names are lost to us. So perhaps through his upbringing at Alfred's court in the presence of scholars such as John the Old Saxon, Athelstan appears to have very much welcomed foreign scholars bearing gifts and new learning to his court. Many came from Brittany, where intensifying Viking raids made it a dangerous place for those in religious orders, and particularly dangerous for anything of value. As a result, Athelstan's court became a centre of intellectual activity, and not only did Athelstan offer shelter to fleeing clerics, but he actively encouraged the dispersal of ideas and the sharing of knowledge across Europe. We have records of an influential Irish scholar, auspiciously named Benedictus of Worthy, being with the king in 931, and the Newminster Winchester Charter writes of a personal group of scholars at court in 925 called Werulf, Gunlaf, Hildewina, and Waltera. At least the last 3 of these names, and quite possibly all 4 of them, are German and not Anglo-Saxon. There are also records of a visit from Israel of Trier, who was possibly a Breton educated in Rome, and of a German embassy coming to Canterbury and taking back ideas of the English Saint Ursula and her virgins to Cologne. We can also tell from the Carta de Regressus, which we looked at earlier, that non-native scholars accompanied Athelstan as he moved around his kingdom, as the writer of this poem, Petrus Peter, is not a normal Anglo-Saxon name. But not only did he welcome visitors from abroad, he sent out reciprocal visits, most notably Bishop Kernwold of Worcester, who went in 929 with Athelstan's sisters to the court of Otto I and embarked on a visit of German churches bearing gifts for each from Athelstan. We have German manuscripts which record his visits and have notes requesting prayers to be made for the English king written on them from this trip. Some go so far as to say that it was during this period of contact and the sharing of ideas, of expanding literary and religious horizons, that the seed of religious and monastic reform was born, which would come to flourish later in the 10th century under King Edgar. Certainly 2 of his sisters married rulers who were known to have taken a keen interest in monasteries famed for monastic reform. The first of these was the monastery at Saint-Benoît-sur-Loire in Fleury, supported by Hugh of the Franks, who had married his sister Eadhild. And the second was the monastery at Cluny, and it's possible that another sister, Eadgifu, who married Charles the Simple, may have encountered Abbot Odo from this house. At the end, I'll test you on who married whom. Not so, therefore, a warrior king simply, but a man deeply concerned with learning and faith, who seems to me to have felt strongly that he should empower religious institutions and benefit from the learning which his international contacts afforded him. Alfred, only perhaps 50 or 60 years before, had lamented the decay of learning in England in his preface to his translation of Gregory the Great's Pastoral Care. He says that learning had declined so thoroughly in England that there were very few men on this side of the Humber who could understand their divine services in English. But during the reign of his grandson, this complaint seems to have been addressed with conviction. Athelstan not only encouraged the learning that already existed, but he also built new religious houses and centres of learning, such as Milton Abbas in Dorset and Muchelney in Somerset. He also provided a bishop at St. Germans for the Cornish, who even, and perhaps especially in Anglo-Saxon times, saw themselves as somewhat distinct from the English. He even seems to have appointed European clergy to increase learning in the Anglo-Saxon church, such as Bishop Theodred of London, the Abbot of Abingdon, Goddeschalk, and the clerics Gundwina, Odgar, and Gossebricht. Here we see how Athelstan not only attracted clerics and scholars from Europe to him, but also how he promoted and protected them and made them a crucial part of his church. Books, of course, formed a large part of this revival of learning and religious fervour. And we have a few examples of manuscripts from Athelstan's reign, which for me stand out as some of the most personal objects ever attributable to a particular king. The next 3 pictures on your handout in figure 6 come from an astonishing manuscript known as the Coronation Gospels, or sometimes the Athelstan Gospels, which are now housed in the British Library. This manuscript, we can say with a certainty that's not always possible for this period of history, passed through the hands of Athelstan himself. This is as tantalizingly close as we can ever get to time travel. This manuscript was put together in the late 9th or perhaps early 10th century, possibly at Lobez Abbey in what we now know as Belgium. It was written and illustrated in the Ottonian style, and most probably came to England into Athelstan's possession as a gift from Otto the Great, who was to marry one of Athelstan's many half-sisters. If you look at the image on the right, you'll see the words inscribed Oda Rex and Michtild Martyrigus, which refers to the German King Otto and his mother Matilda. During his time, Athelstan gave this manuscript to Christ Church, Canterbury, as the inscription in the left-hand picture attests. As a result, a scribe, perhaps a little sycophantically, wrote the poem which you can see an extract of on the same page, addressed to Rex Pius Athelstan. For the poet, Athelstan's religious piety and his power in battle go hand in hand, and he doesn't exactly hold back in his expression of sentiment. Holy King Æthelstan, renowned through the whole world, whose esteem flourishes and whose honour endures everywhere, whom God set as king over the English, sustained by the foundation of the throne, and as leader of his earthly forces, plainly so that this king himself, mighty in war, might be able to conquer other fierce kings, treading down their fierce necks. How often is it that we see poetry addressed to Anglo-Saxon kings, giving such an authentic insight into Anglo-Saxon views of kingship and religion? It's not every day. Some speculate that this poem was written into the manuscript after the Battle of Brunanburg, which appears to have been seen by contemporaries as not only a show of might, but as a demonstration of divine favour, an image which would endure in the centuries to come. I'd also like to point out as a slight tangent that this manuscript had a rather interesting second life later in time, after it came into the hands of the 17th century manuscript collector, Sir Robert Cotton. For some reason that still eludes modern historians, Cotton appears to have thought that this book had been intended by Athelstan to be the book used by kings to swear their oaths of kingship on. We have a letter which suggests that Cotton passed this on to Charles I in order to fulfill this purpose, although sadly there is no evidence that Charles used it in this way. But I digress. The next image on your handout is another beautiful example of a manuscript which made its way to England during Athelstan's reign. Despite this being called the Athelstan Psalter, however, we cannot claim it actually belonged to Athelstan himself, although it is far from impossible. It was written and illustrated in northeast Francia, sometime in the 9th century, and it is filled with beautiful images like this one, miniatures and illustrated initials. I would very much recommend having a look at the British Library website, where the whole book has been digitised and you can flick through it at your leisure and see the beautiful artwork in it. It's absolutely gorgeous. It too found its way into the collection of Sir Robert Cotton, although he appears not to have taken quite such a shine to this one. Turning over the page, figure 8 is another manuscript which we know was in Athelstan's hands, attested by the inscription which you can see on the right-hand side, which records Athelstan's gift of the manuscript to St. Augustine's in Canterbury. This one came from Brittany, possibly either as a result of Athelstan's correspondence with Radbod, who was the prior of St. Sampson at Dol, or possibly brought over with clergy fleeing the Vikings and seeking Athelstan's patronage. Figure 9 is an unusual page from an Irish manuscript, written in Bangor in County Down, which has a note in it telling us that an Irish bishop called Dub Inza received it from King Æthelstan, and that it was accompanied by a certain Frenchman and Israel of Trier, whom I mentioned earlier. This shows a game called Alia Evangelii, or Gospel Dice, which is explained at length in the manuscript, although I've never quite been able to get my head round it personally. Sarah Foote explains it. It's an allegorized board game, a numerological treatise that attempted to correlate a complex arrangement of pieces on the board with the canon tables. Don't say that the Anglo-Saxons didn't know how to have a good time. I have chosen these manuscripts to show in the handouts partly because they show the beauty and expense accorded to religious learning at this time, partly because you can see a very real and tangible association with Athelstan as an individual, especially in figures 6, 8, and 9, and partly because they show that these types of books were coming to England from different places on the continent and making their way to Athelstan's court, or at least very close to it. There are a few more, most notably a pocket gospel book from Ireland, which was inscribed with the names of Athelstan and the Irish scholar Maelbert MacTormain. But we are constrained by space, so you'll be pleased to know that I haven't prepared something on that to talk to you about too. There can be no doubt in my mind that the evidence of valuable religious and didactic texts in Athelstan's possession and in England in general are largely due to the support of the king himself. And I am equally sure that this learning, which was brought to England, permeated into local centres of learning, although our relative lack of remaining evidence does make this a difficult claim to substantiate. Nevertheless, the image on the front page of your handout comes from the only existing manuscript written wholly in England during Athelstan's reign. It is a copy of the Venerable Bede's Life of St. Cuthbert, and it is quite likely that this particular manuscript was commissioned especially for Athelstan to give to the community of St. Cuthbert at Chester Street, as it shows him wearing a distinctive three-pronged crown, standing and presenting the book to St. Cuthbert himself. He seems to have had a particular fondness for this northern saint, as you may be able to see from figure 10 on your handout. This particular piece of evidence defies history in its survival. It appears that Athelstan, on a visit to the north in 934, visited the tomb of St. Cuthbert and left there a collection of exquisite Byzantine silks and textiles, along with an ivory comb and this manuscript, amongst others. This fragment shows only the tiniest fraction of the gloriousness of the fabric and detail of the embroidery, and it is extremely difficult to photograph without risking damage to the fabric. As you can imagine, textiles tend not to endure that well, and it seems a testament to Cuthbert's saintliness that we are able to see Anglo-Saxon evidence of embroidery in this condition today over 1,000 years after it was made. Here you can see Peter the deacon as part of a maniple, but in the same collection there is also a bishop's stole and girdle. The house history book of the community of St. Cuthbert records even further riches left on the same visit. 2 chasubles, an alb, 3 altar coverings, 3 curtains, 7 pallia on top of those vestments which we can still see today. This is such an extremely fervent display of religious affection, and we are fortunate to catch a glimpse of it today. The pigeon seems excited by it in particular. This faith appears to have permeated different areas of his rule beyond the patronage of learning and the church. For he was, as is declared on the coin that you can see in figure 11, Rex Totius Britanniae, the king of the whole of Britain, and with this came legislative and administrative responsibility and authority. If you look at the final image on your handout, for example, you'll see an extract from the Textus Rufensis, which is the Rochester book, in which some of Athelstan's laws are recorded. Like most Anglo-Saxon kings, he covered a number of different topics within his law code, such as minting rights and laws on theft, but there's one in particular which jumps out at me. I have painstakingly gone through the digitized version of this manuscript to get an image of the particular reference that I'm talking about. What you are looking at in this image is Athelstan's personal declaration that the age of the death penalty should be raised from 12 to 15 on the basis that it was too cruel. You may be able to see in the first line the Old English phrase, se kerning quath. The Old English S's look like elongated R's, if that helps you find it. It's on the first line. Se kerning quath. The king says. This is Athelstan directly intervening in the legal administration of his reign. This is as close as we can get to hearing him speak. This is him telling us exactly how he feels about a particular subject. And that is pretty amazing. And we not only see this faith in his governance, but also the learning which he prized so highly too. Here I'll try my best to get you excited about charters again. I've noted that Athelstan welcomed and encouraged scholars, and that he appears to have urged the sharing of learning in his kingdom. During his reign, we see a change in the language of government. And this appears as a direct result of the application of learning. From 928, there develops in Athelstan's charters a new poetic and exaggeratedly complex style known as the hermeneutic style of language, which owed so much to the bombast of a famous Latin scholar, Aldhelm. We know that Athelstan admired this scholar and was given a copy of his De Virginitatis when he was younger, although not everyone has been quite so fond of the pretentious style which pervaded these new charters. William of Malmesbury, for all that he glorified Athelstan, was not a fan. I'm going to read you an extract of one of these so-called Athelstan A charters, and you can make up your own mind. Bear in mind as you listen that these were official documents and normally concerned the granting of land and privileges and the definition of boundaries. This extract comes from the text shown in figure 3 of your handout. If, however, God forbid, anyone swollen with diabolic spirit should be tempted to diminish or annul this brief document of my arrangement and confirmation, let him know that on the final and great day of judgment, when the archangel's shrill trumpet rings out, when graves burst open by themselves and give up the bodies now revived, when every element trembles, with the traitor Judas, who is called son of perdition by the sower's merciful offspring, he is to perish in eternal confusion within the hungry flames of unspeakable torments. Not quite your typical formal document. Perhaps you're now beginning to understand why some people get excited by charters. What is also significant about these charters, beyond their Latinity and poetical style, is that there appears to have been just one single scribe responsible for them. This we have inferred from the fact that there are several of these charters in exactly the same style and written in the same hand, which have been written and granted in different areas of the country. This is a new departure and is indicative almost of an official royal chancery which attended Athelstan as he went around his kingdom, exercising his royal rights to grant land across his realm. The image which emerges for me of Athelstan, therefore, goes beyond a king who establishes significant victory and claims the grandest title of any Anglo-Saxon king yet. I see an emergence of the awareness of the grandeur of kingship on King Athelstan's part, which is founded strongly on his faith. As we've seen in the poetry of his reign, his military successes were seen to have been bound up inextricably with his faith, as it is through divine favor and intervention that he was perceived to have achieved such victories. We've heard tonight about his fervour for relics and the generosity with which he distributed these amongst his religious houses to endow and support these establishments. William of Malmesbury notes that there was scarcely any ancient house in all England that he did not adorn with buildings or ornaments, books or estates. And certainly his own Malmesbury benefited hugely from the king's support. You have seen tonight the evidence of some of these donations to religious houses in the inscriptions found in medieval manuscripts. And this is but one sign of the improvement of learning which Athelstan promoted through his international relations. Relations founded on marriage and developed significantly through the spread of religious ideas and learning. This support for the church and for learning in England can be seen to have had an impact on his governance, from his law codes to the Latinity of his charters, the latter of which particularly shows the development of a more official and grander sense of kingship. This, in turn, we can see pervading different aspects, from coinage to artwork. The picture on the front page of your handout is the earliest surviving royal portrait known to us. In England, he was declared by his subjects not just King of all Britain, but also often King of the English, elevated by the right hand of the Almighty to the throne of the whole kingdom of Britain. I hope, therefore, that you will share with me tonight the notion of Athelstan not just as a bold and victorious warrior, but as an innovating ruler, moved by his faith and by a belief in the power of learning to rule as a Christian king. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Caroline. No, stay up there, please. Because I thank you for that fascinating insight into the character of what I think of as our favourite son. I hope you'll be prepared to answer some questions. Does anyone have a question?
Is there a particular explanation for why Athelstan doesn't feature more in the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle?
Not a good one. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, while being a sort of go-to source for Anglo-Saxon history, was not actually always contemporaneous. A lot of the time it seems to have been filled in by chroniclers who weren't actually living at the time of the events that happened, particularly later on in the Anglo-Saxon period. It is odd that there are only 6 mentions of Athelstan in it, but the fact that one of those is in poetry is really strange and really exciting, because Athelstan seems to have been somebody who particularly patronized poets. You see this amazing outpouring of poetry in his reign, and actually Sarah Foote argues, and whether you want to believe it or not is up to you. She argues that Beowulf might have been composed during his reign. There's certainly evidence of, I've shown you a couple of poems in here. If you look at the 12th century Scandinavian text, Egil's Saga, that includes poems that were contemporaneous to Athelstan's time, and they've got skaldic elements in them coming across from Old Norse, which says to me that he's got people at his court who are interested in poetry, and that's the only explanation I can give you for why we've got such an unusual array of records for him in the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle.
You touched on the links between Athelstan and Hywel Dda, Hywel the Good. They seem to have had quite an interaction, these two. Was that because they were both interested in learning and codifying of laws? Because Hywel Dda codified this was the basis of Welsh law. Is that the link between them? Because I think they seem to be quite close rather than just a conquest issue.
Quite possibly. Hywel Dda is famed for his laws. He is known as the lawmaker. He is really important in the formation of Middle Welsh legal texts. And it is quite possible that he and Athelstan found some sort of level ground between the two of them. For the most part, Hywel Dda is featured in Athelstan's charter witness list as a subregulus. He is a sub-king. He's not a king in his own right. He defers to Athelstan. But that doesn't necessarily mean that he was particularly under the thumb of Athelstan. It just means that he recognized Athelstan's superiority. And therefore it is very possible that there was interaction between the two of them, and certainly the spread of ideas and of learning across Europe, and particularly across England and Wales and the British Isles, would point to influence between the two of them, without doubt.
You mentioned about the relics that he collected and then also distributed. Were they used only as a source of, if you like, veneration or, I don't know, worship perhaps, or were they also a means of raising money, income?
Sort of one comes with the other, because if you have a relic, you can attract pilgrims, and pilgrims pay you money. So having relics is a wonderful devotional aspect of any particular monastery or religious institution that has them. But it is also a bit of a honey trap for whoever happens to have them, because people will come to venerate them. And as part of that, they will buy pilgrim badges, they will give you money, they will ask for prayers to be said in their name, and they will give people money in order to do that. So it was very much a question of them both together.
Just as a follow-on then, do you think that this is a sort recognition of learning and so on, or a recognition of superstition that he was propagating?
I don't think it was superstition. I think it was genuine faith. I believe, and I have absolutely no evidence to base this on, but nobody has any evidence to base this on. I think that Athelstan shows in so many aspects of his life a genuine devotion and very clear piety. I think that his pursuit of relics is an indication of that, rather than being particularly bound up with superstition, although you do often see elements of superstition in early religion. I do think it was a genuine conviction that these were the real objects and they were to be venerated, and that by giving them to different institutions, he was helping other people access these as well. If you look at his actions in Chester Street at the bones of St. Cuthbert, he left the most amazing riches there. He asked for 2 goblets to be filled with silver coins to enrich this particular place, and he left these beautiful silks in the coffin that contained Cuthbert. And I don't think you do that unless you genuinely, passionately believe in what you're seeing there.
I wondered if there were any interesting source documents describing Athelstan to be found from the courts of those to whom the sisters were married, or perhaps the Vatican itself, given he was such a good Christian.
Not descriptions of him physically in particular, or anything to give us any sort of meaty pieces of information, but you do see things like the way in which people describe him. He's described in Ireland as the pillar of the European world, something like that. And over on the continent, he's given the same titles that we see given to the Byzantine emperors, which doesn't show much about Athelstan particularly, but it does show us what other people thought of him. And that's a really valuable source of information for us, because we can tell that he is renowned through the world, maybe not the entire world, but the world which was known to the Anglo-Saxons. And if you can manage to get your image, your reputation spreading over such a wide area, that's a real attestation to his power, and his power that he really had, not power that he had pretensions to. That's really important.
Here in Kingston, we have a school called Athelstan, and we have a road called Athelstan, and we supposedly had several Anglo-Saxon kings crowned here in Kingston. How true is it that actually kings have been crowned here in Kingston?
We don't know. You can say for certainty that there were several kings crowned here. We can absolutely guarantee that. We can suspect that there were, I think, up to 9, as I recall, that are quite likely to have been crowned here. It's a really good location here because you're sort of on the boundaries of Mercia and Wessex, and they're the 2 biggest Anglo-Saxon kingdoms. So being crowned here, not only are you easy to access, but you're very inclusive. You are showing a real progression in kingship towards bringing the traditional kingdom boundaries together. So it's very possible that quite a few kings were crowned here. It's absolutely very plausible.
Who crowned Athelstan? And if it wasn't the Archbishop of Canterbury, who was it? And did he have a mint here in Kingston?
It was the Archbishop of Canterbury. He not only crowns Athelstan, but he creates a new ordo, which is like an order of service, especially for crowning an Anglo-Saxon king who is a king not of just of one kingdom, but of 2 peoples. So he's bringing both Mercia and Wessex together when he crowns Athelstan. And he also endows him with a crown. Most Anglo-Saxon kings up to now have been crowned with helmets on. Athelstan has a crown, and it's the crown that you see in the picture on the front page of your handouts. It's the crown that we start to see on coinage from his reign. So it's really important. This is an enormous symbol of what is becoming, what's happening in Anglo-Saxon England. He gives him a sword, he gives him a rod of state. So that's really important. What was the second part of your question? Did he have a mint? I don't know. Athelstan was quite concerned with coinage and with minting rights. A lot of his codes that he wrote up do concern making sure that mints are properly supervised, that they are only ever authorized by the king, and that they follow certain standards. We can also tell that people took absolutely no notice of this whatsoever, because in later law codes, he laments the fact that nobody's taken any notice whatsoever. So I'm not sure if there was a mint. My husband's got my book, and he's shaking his head. There was no mint here in Kingston, and we're all learning things tonight.
Well, I think that seems to have exhausted us all. Thank you very much, Caroline. That was absolutely fascinating, and very pleased to have welcomed you here. And we hope you've had a chance to look around the place while you're here and see it for yourself. But thank you very much.
Well, thank you.
Thank you very, very much for everyone for coming. I know many people have come to all of our lectures, so thank you very much. This was the last one in our series this year, but we are absolutely hoping to run the series again next year with some brand new lectures. So we have a kind of a sign-up sheet by the door. If you're interested in learning more about the lectures coming up next year or any other heritage news, please do feel free to put your email address down before you leave. The bar is open if you wanted to grab another drink. Please feel free and have a look around as well. But thank you very, very much.